All right, I think people can probably see me, and if you've just joined us or you're trying to just join us, you may realize that we have been not present for a period of time here. Uh, we won't talk about this. You're watching or trying to watch the Schiller Institute conference entitled The Path Forward from September 11th, Afghanistan, and the Surveillance State. We were hearing Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, who was speaking to us. And I think what we're going to try to do is to have her pick up on her remarks in a moment. I just want to make sure that that everybody else understands what we're here to do. And I think what I'll do is I'll go at the moment to Bill Binney, since Helga was interrupted, and for her to try to make the point that she was making, she may want to just come back and respond. I think that's probably better. So William Binney, who is with us from National Security Agency, will probably have something to say. So far, what we've covered, if you saw our earlier portions of this webcast, you know that we have talked about September 11th. Helga went through and described the policy moving forward for Afghanistan. Now we want to talk a bit about the last. Suppose you were charged with the responsibility of defending the United States from all of its enemies, foreign and domestic, on the day of and prior to the days before 9/11. Suppose you had been part of a team that had developed a way to filter out any terrorist capabilities threatening the United States or any other country, as long as those terrorist capabilities used cell phones or computers or any form of electronic communications. Suppose you were part of the largest surveillance capability in the entire world, and you had this system, but you were prevented from deploying it. And suppose you then watched while the very disaster that you were tasked to prevent unfolded before your very eyes. Now, then suppose you resigned after that, immediately after that, and set out on a quest to bring the people to account that were actually responsible for that kind of breach of security. But instead of that occurring, the very system that you helped to develop was then used to surveil the American people. Suppose you inspired other people who came from your neck of the woods to protest as well. And those people were treated to indictment and raids, and in some cases, as in the case of Edward Snowden, were forced to flee the country. Suppose it was now 20 years later, you were still fighting to do what you were fighting to do in the days before 9/11. What would you expect the American people to do? Would you expect the American people to oppose dictatorship by surveillance, government by blackmail, rule by intimidation, thought control through ignorance and drug addictions and virtual reality? Well, Bill Binney, who is a 30-year veteran of the National Security Agency and quit the NSA after 30 years, 1 month after the September 11th events, who's also former technical director of the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis and Reporting section of NSA, is here. He's been here often, and he's going to speak to us a bit, not merely about what happened on that day and why it happened, but what has to be done now to deal with the complexity of problems that have now come into being in the aftermath of this. And then we will return to Helga, ask if she's got any things she'd like to say, both in response to Bill and further because of her interruption of her speech. We'll come back to her and then we'll proceed. So, Bill.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to address the listening audience here. My problem with the 9/11 events and all the other events around the world is that there's this, I think Helga was getting at, there's this society, secret society of cabal of government agencies and people involved in management of those agencies, as well as politically elected individuals who are a part of this mechanism that I call the secret government. But it involves technology and the media, and they're all cooperating now. This is what the evolution of this totalitarian state has done, and this is what surveillance has given them power to do. It's given them power over everyone, so they can force people through fear of being harassed of one form or another to do exactly what they want them to do, and that's basically our country has evolved into a fear mongering. Look at the. I take the COVID response to COVID-19 as one of the examples of what is evolving here about fear mongering. Why did we dispose of the standard practices for handling infectious diseases that were developed over hundreds of years, not just to isolate people who were infected and those in the vicinity of them, but also to isolate perfectly healthy people, everybody. I mean, this was crazy nonsense, a total violation of the evolution of all the protocols set up to handle those kinds of diseases. But this entire process is being set and manipulated and managed by this secret government saying, here's how we can fearmonger to get people to do exactly what we want them to do. Look how we can force them to wear masks. Look how they all kowtail down and do as they're told. And this is exactly what a totalitarian state wants. And this is the evolution that I saw coming back in 9/11 when they started introducing this massive spying on people. And they didn't have to do that. They knew they didn't, but they did it because it gave them power over everybody. And it was a way of evolving the power, control, and money in a central organization or central cabal, if you will, of government officials, media, and bankers, and technology and industry and various sorts. Eisenhower referred to it as the military-industrial complex, but it's really much more than that. That includes parts of government as well, and it's been taken into all parts of our government. Even when you could see it from the last election, and that Trump was a classic case. He was not part of the organization, and the whole thing turned against him, and they tried to get rid of him from the very beginning. I mean, that just showed you the degree to which our government has been corrupted. Now, it's really going to take a major surgery and major changes to get our government back on track. But all we have to do is focus back on the Constitution and the rights of individuals in the Constitution and enforcing them and holding people accountable. Not just to say, well, they shouldn't have done it, but they were thinking they had to do it to save people or do make it better in their society. Well, I'm sorry, they're violating the Constitution in my book. That's fundamental treason against the founding principles of this nation. And I've never changed from that. I mean, I've always focused on the Constitution as the issue. That's what we should enforce, human rights for everybody, not just here, but around the world. And, I endorse all of which Helga was talking about. We need a new way of doing business, this military-industrial complex and the associated cabal of individuals involved in government and private industry and media. That has to end. And in order to stop that, we've got to unify, get together, and oppose it, start fundamentally at the base, and then just fire everybody that was involved, and also hold them accountable by indictments. You cannot, when Obama said, when he came in and said, we're not going to look back, we're going to look forward. Well, that told me right away he was not going to fix any problem, and he was going to accept the crimes that have been committed all along and continue them. And that's exactly what's happened. So I've not seen any change, and we're still headed in that direction. So unless we fundamentally get together and rise up as a country and throw these people out and then hold them accountable in a court of law, we're not going to save ourselves.
Thank you very, very much, Bill. And I think if Helga's there, are you there, Helga?
Yeah, yes, I'm here.
Okay, fine. So now that we've managed to return after you were sort of bonked on the head there by Bill has a view of what occurred. We'll allude to that a little later. But if there's anything you'd like to say, either or at this point, since you were interrupted, I want to give you the opportunity.
Well, I was pretty much coming to the end of my remarks. I just said that, that the entire paradigm of the last, well, probably longer than 20, but let's take the 9/11 as a starting point. That whole paradigm has led to only catastrophe. And, I think it is for any person in their life or any nation in history, when you reach such a point, the big question is, can you correct those things, or are you condemned to repeat these errors until, the total disaster has been arrived at. And I think that I agree with Bill Binney, to go back to the Constitution, to go back to the world's constitution, or a sort of world's constitution, which is the United Nations Charter. And this is a very precious good, because international law was developed in a very hard process. It came out of the Peace of Westphalia, the recognition that if you continue with the 30 Years' War, which was the end phase of a 150-year religious war, if you would continue that, nobody would be left to enjoy victory, because all would be dead. And that was really the point when the warring parties were sitting together on one table, and they developed the Peace of Westphalia. And the principles of that treaty evolved into international law, which found its manifestation in the UN Charter. So I think we have to go back to the US Constitution, to the UN Charter, to the constitutions of other countries,
And again, if you've just joined us again, you're watching or attempting to watch the Schiller Institute's conference, The Path Forward from September 11th, Afghanistan, and the Surveillance State. We are experiencing unusual weather, apparently, on the internet. At least we are. And each time that Helga starts speaking, we're getting this interruption. What we're going to do is the following, especially because some people may have just joined and may not know what's been going on. But we've been up since 2:03, and we've had two disruptions. And what we're going to do in order to sort of regain continuity is to go to a video presentation which is done by Terry Strada. She was interviewed recently, and she is the head of the 9/11 Families and Survivors United for Justice Against Terrorism. So she's at the ceremonies that were going on down at Ground Zero, and therefore we have this statement from her.
So just recently on August 5th, but I guess if I back it up, I could say last October, I started working with members in the House trying to introduce a new piece of legislation called the 9/11 Transparency Act. And I was garnering support for it in the House. Every member that I spoke with, or every member's staff, because COVID was going on, so a lot of these meetings were like this or on the phone, and they were all in agreement. Something needs to be done. These files cannot be kept a secret any longer. It's been 20 years or going on 20 years. There's not a threat to national security probably in a lot of this, and it's time to release whatever we can. It was decided that it made sense to go over to the Senate, and Senator Menendez, a Democrat in New Jersey, he was the one that stood up and said, I'll do it. And he also is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, which is a very powerful position to have. He got Senators Blumenthal and Senators Grassley and Senator Booker on board. But most importantly, he got Senator Schumer on board, who happens to be the lead of the Senate. This was really important, and we did this big press conference on August 5th to announce the legislation and to tell the reporters that were there listening why it's so important to learn the truth about the Saudi connection. And I guess, what was one of my more powerful speeches, because after I gave it, they went and they entered it in the congressional record, which I was very proud to have that happen, and very proud to stand there with those senators speaking the truth of how important it is that young people my age, all the family members understand how this country was so brutally attacked, and that if the Saudis have nothing to hide, they have nothing to worry about. But there's been just too much time that's gone by, and they were saying that this mandatory declassification review process was necessary, and they were going to go forward with it. Well, the White House got their attention, and they understood pretty clear, because it was introduced in the House the very next day by Hakeem Jeffries and Richard Pascal, I think. Anyhow, it didn't take long for the White House to say, this is powerful, this is going to happen, we have a choice here. We can either get ahead of it. We kept asking for the president, bring it to your desk quickly. You can sign this at any time. You don't need it to go through all of the avenues that a bill normally goes through. It was a simple bill. It was based on the Abbottabad language, which when they raided the Abbottabad complex and killed Osama bin Laden, they brought back troves of information on computer disks and papers and all of that. And everything was classified. And Congress wrote a piece of legislation that made everything go through this mandatory declassification review process, and that released a lot of the documents. So that's the same premise of this legislation. And the president said, okay, I think it's going to happen. I can do this. And he turned it into an executive order rather than a piece of legislation. He actually shortened up some of the dates and lengthened them in other places. So the very first set of documents should go through this process and be released before September 11th. And that's a 2016 summary of Operation Encore, which is that 10-year secret investigation that the FBI did on the kingdom. And that summary should be released to the greatest extent possible this week. And then the EO, the executive order goes on to talk about in the next 30 days what will come available, and then 30 days after that. He gives it a 6-month period for all of these documents to go through this review process. And the accountability mechanism that is installed in the legislation now in the EO is that they have to answer to the President of the United States of America. They can no longer go behind closed doors and keep things a secret without explanation. So they have to answer the President, and they have to answer to the chairman of both intelligence committees, both in the House and the Senate. Now they have to answer to all of them. And that is a very positive step, but we don't know until we see the first document exactly how serious they are and what they're going to reveal. But I'm looking forward to seeing them. So I would say that, the biggest question that we've had all these years is, was there a support network put in place in the United States prior to the September 11th attacks? And if that support network was put in place, which I very much believe was, what did it look like? And that's what this Operation Encore, that investigation into the Saudi connection, is what I believe will start to come out, and we will see more details of what that apparatus, that support system actually looked like. So more names will become available, telephone numbers, money transfers, who was transferring the money, and are there other Saudi nationals that were also helping some of the other hijackers? Because right now we know of two. We know of al-Bayoumi and al-Thumari, who were tasked to meet and greet the first arriving hijackers out in San Diego. And that's what our lawsuit is premised on, because that's what the judge ordered discovery on, that we had enough evidence when we went to the courtroom. And she said, okay, you can go forward with it on these two individuals and on these two hijackers. But just think about it. If we know of 3 people that were involved with those 2, and there's 17 more, so 3 to 4 more Saudi nationals, there's just a trove of information that we don't know because they've kept it from us.
So what we're going to do, partially because of the disruptions, but also because of what you just heard, is ask that we get some responses from our group. I want to first of all ask Bill Binney something concerning what we just heard, and then we're going to go to Helga, assuming that everything doesn't crash as soon as she starts talking. But Bill, you just heard what Terry had to say, and you saw the question, which is, what does it mean that you have these tens of thousands of documents and so on? Can you say something about what is actually going on here, and what might be actually done if people were serious about getting to the bottom of this? Is he frozen? He's frozen. So you mean Helga's the only one that we have that's alive? How about Harley? Is he frozen too? Let's go to Helga. Hey, maybe she'll survive this time. Okay, there you are.
Okay. I hope I will not freeze again, but no, I think I agree with what Terry just said. One has to see the first documents. Do they reveal any interesting facts? Will they be heavily redacted? We have seen many times that these documents come out and then they're all blacked out and you can't see anything. But I think the crucial question is, that obviously the question of Afghanistan was, ill-defined because, okay, maybe the Taliban did give refuge to bin Laden, but what about this large group of Saudis who were able to leave the country as the only ones immediately following the attacks? I mean, there are so many questions, and I think, until the light of that is shed, we have to keep fighting this issue.
Yeah, and I'll also point out that in the earlier conversation we had, you pointed out that what needs to be looked at is how are people in the United States right now responding, not merely to the events of 9/11 or even the dispute about the events of 9/11, but what should be done, both in terms of Afghanistan, but more importantly, this whole surveillance state. And maybe what we can do is get back into discussion about that. What I think we'll do is go to the Ray McGovern, who, for various reasons, was not able to join us on the platform, has prepared a talk about something which I think is important for Americans. I want to just set this up a little bit. Ray was a CIA analyst for 27 years, specializing in Russia. And what he's done is to prepare something based on a kind of discussion he's had actually on the platform here several times around what he keeps referring to as metanoia. This means the ability to undergo a conversion of one's views, to change your axioms, to suddenly get an insight into the fact that everything that you've been doing has been either wrong or has been misplaced, and to come up with a completely different conception. So what he's prepared is a discussion of two Russian poets, but from the standpoint of intelligence. Lyndon LaRouche once wrote a paper called Poetry Must Supersede Mathematics and Physics. And he used to make a big point of talking about the poet and thinker Edgar Poe, not Edgar Allan Poe, which he never called himself, Edgar Poe. And that Poe's method of what he called ratiocination, which is shown in the first detective stories. Poe was the inventor of what we call the detective story for all intents and purposes, was to make sure that you were capable of examining your deepest assumptions about people, and then from there draw conclusions which were of a strategic nature. So we'll now hear from Ray McGovern, and then from there we'll come back for our discussion.
I appreciate this opportunity to talk not only about 9/11, but the Teardrop Memorial, which virtually no Americans know about, probably because it was given to us by the Russians. To clear up a few things about Russia, I've been studying Russia for 60 years now. I'm ashamed to admit I'm so old, but that's how long I've been with this problem. I also want to say something about my friend Julian Assange, since his exit from that embassy in London in his disheveled state accounts for my disheveled state. This is 2.5 years of trying to express solidarity with Julian. I mentioned Julian because if WikiLeaks were up and running, 9/11 would never have happened. I'll say that again. If WikiLeaks were up and running, 9/11 would never have happened. How do I know that? I know that because the FBI people who worked in the Minnesota office with Colleen Rowley were asked that. They were asked, if you had a chance to get your message out to the public, other than sacrificing your career, would you have gone to WikiLeaks? And they said yes. And so did Bogdan Zakovich, who led the red teams for the Transportation Security Agency. And he could penetrate any airplane, any airport. And they were tearing their hair out because they knew what was coming, but they couldn't get a hearing anywhere. And I asked Bogdan, would you have gone to WikiLeaks? And he said, surely I would have. So that's what's cut off now. That's why Julian Assange is so important. That's why they want him to just go away. And I want to just say a word about Julian in comparison to the most famous Russian poet, Alexander Pushkin, because Pushkin himself was saying untoward things, publishing untoward things, and he was sent to prison in Kishinev, and he wrote a poem. And I'm going to recite this poem. It was called Uznik, which means prisoner. So he's sitting in this dark, dank cell in Kishinev, which is now Moldova, I believe. And he's composing this poem, and he says, «Сижу за решеткой в темнице серой, вскормленный в неволе орел молодой, мой грустный товарищ, макая крылом, кровавую пищу клюет под окном. Okay, I'm sitting in this dark dance cell in the darkness, and I see outside my window a crow. It's got some kill, and it's throwing it around, a very bloody kill. And he looks into the window, смотрит в окно, как будто со мною задумал одно, as though he's thinking the same as what I'm thinking. Криком своим зовет меня взглядом и криком своим и вымолвить хочет, давай, улетим. He looks at me, and with a scream, he says, look, let's get out of here. Мы вольные птицы. Пора, брат, пора. Туда, где за тучей белеет гора, туда, где зинеют морские края, туда, где гуляем лишь ветер, да я. Let's get out of here. Let's go to where beyond the clouds, you see the snow-capped mountains, where you see the blue sea outside there, where only the wind and I, this little crow, well, the word is to wander around on a sort of Sunday, where only we can kind of walk around at our leisure. I say that because Pushkin was in the same kind of prison situation as my friend Julian Assange. Julian has been in prison much longer than Pushkin. Pushkin got out. But when you think about the Russians and the gift that they were to humanity in the 19th century, Pushkin is universally recognized as one of the greatest poets of the 19th century. I also want to put a gloss on what we understand about the Russian experience, because there's so much misunderstanding about Russia. I spend a lot of time in Germany, and there's a pin that the Germans have. It says, Putin verstehe, okay? Now, verstehen is to understand, okay? So Putin verstehe is somebody who understands Putin. Now, I would think that's a pretty good thing, pretty good quality. But no, that's a real pejorative in Germany. Putin verstehe? No, you're like one of those Trump people, right? You think you're like one of those people who thinks that Trump is in Putin's pocket. So there's so much misunderstanding that I want to point out just a couple of things from my experience in the Soviet Union and then in Russia during my career and after. In 1972, I was there for the signing of the first Strategic Arm Limitation Talks Treaty, the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was the cornerstone of strategic stability for the next 30 years, count them, 3 decades, okay? I got around there and I was harassed. The KGB was all over me. And it was the people were very nice, but the regime was not right. It confirmed my suspicions. It confirmed my view of what the Soviet system was like. Now, if you fast forward many years after the fall of the Soviet Union and the breakout of Russia into its own, I was there, I was there in 2015. And it was the 75th anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe. Now, the Elbe was the river going through Germany, where Soviet forces and U.S. forces finally met, and that was April 25, 1945. So this was a big anniversary, okay? And I was asked to give a little talk, which I did. There was somebody from the embassy that also talked. And then there was this big 6'5" general, 1 star, 92, okay? And he talked. And as soon as we were finished with the formal proceedings, he came up to me and he said, Studebaker, Studebaker, Studebaker. I'm thinking, oh, sure. Now, not many people know that Studebaker, when it wanted to fulfill the mission of supplying the Russian armies, Soviet armies, with trucks, they retooled their whole machinery and made what we later in the Army called deuce and a halfs, 2.5 ton trucks. Now, how many did they make? Would you believe 200,000? And what was this general referring to? It was a 1-star. So he saw the battle. And he knew how essential it was through Lend-Lease to get Studebakers to move his troops, to move his ammunition, to mount machine guns, to carry the fight to the Nazis and defeat them. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that Studebaker to this general was a very big deal. Now, when I was called to active duty in the 60s, we were still using those deuce and a halfs, those 2.5 ton trucks manufactured by Studebaker. The next year, a citizen delegation and I went to Yalta in the Crimea. It was the first U.S. group of its kind to visit Yalta or Crimea since the big fracas about the coup in Kiev and the downing of MH17, the Malaysian aircraft, which killed 298 people. So we were treated with great joy. Here we are visiting Crimea, which had opted to rejoin Russia. And it was the anniversary of another very infamous date. It was the date on which the German armies pounced on the Soviet Union. June 22nd. So this was 2016 minus 1941. I did the math here. It was the 75th anniversary. Now, the people in Crimea and Yalta were delighted we were there, and they asked if someone from a delegation would say some remarks. And I volunteered. And it struck me, given the people there were hundreds of people, many of them were older than I. Now, I was born 1 week before the Nazi armies invaded Poland. So I was alive all during World War II. These people were older than I. As a matter of fact, some of them looked like they had husbands, uncles, whatever, who died in World War II. And so I looked there and I said, I think I will recite the poem that I learned in college by the Russian poet named Nekrasov. He was called the Poet Ruskoy Skarabli, the poet of Russian pain, really. It was about the same time as Dostoevsky in the 19th century. And here's the way this one goes. The title is Vnimaya ужасом войны. Now, войны is война, war. Война и мир is war and peace, okay? The Vnimaya, paying attention to, and ужас is almost onomatopoeia, huh? It's the horrors. So, Vnimaya ужасом войны, regarding the horrors of war. Внимая ужасом войны при каждой новой жертве боя. Мне жаль не друга, не жены, мне жаль не самого героя. Увы, утешится жена, и друга лучший друг забудет. Okay. Paying attention to the horrors of war. At the fall of each each hero on the battlefield, I feel very sad, but not so much for the wife, not so much for the friend of the fallen, not so much even for the fallen victim himself. Hopefully, his wife will be consoled, and best friends forget their best friends. Друга лучший друг забудет, а где-то есть душа одна, надо гроба помнить будет. But uniquely, there is one spirit, dusha, one soul, who will not forget, will remember to the grave. Сред лицемерных наших тел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел святые, искренние слезы. So, among all the frivolous and mundane things of everyday life, unique among all these things, have I found the tears of mothers. То слезы бедных матерей, им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве. So, those are the tears of mothers who don't forget their children who perish on the bloody battlefield. So, то слезы бедных матерей, им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве, как никогда плохуше иве своих поникнувших детей. Just as a weeping willow tree can never lift up its branches. То слезы бедных матерей, им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве, как не понять. Just as a weeping willow tree, не понять, cannot lift up its branches, so too it is. So what am I saying here? Well, I'm saying that the Russians have had a historical experience that is very, very different from us Americans. They spent 2.5 centuries, mind you, under what they call the Tatarskaya Iga, the Tartar yoke, where Genghis Khan and his friends dominated Russia for 2.5 centuries. And when they got freed from that, it was Ivan the Terrible that finally got things together. Then they were attacked by the Swedes, and then by the Lithuanians, and then by the Hanseatic League, okay? And finally, they get into better shape. And what happens? They're invaded by Napoleon and later the Nazis. Now, how many people did Russia lose in World War II? The figures are firm. It's 26 million people plus. 26 million people plus. Now, where'd they come from? Well, they came from the same areas of Europe where US and NATO forces are building up strength right now. So you don't have to be a 75-year-old Russian to understand from Russian history what that means. So last thing I'll say is that it doesn't help to demean the Russians, to say that they're a third-rate power, or, as one of our presidents said, Russia is really a gas station posing as a country. So image this, please. Alexander Pushkin pumping gas, or Tchaikovsky changing oil. Yeah. Or Dostoevsky keeping book. Yeah, right. A gas station posing as a country. So we have to get rid of these myths. We have to accept the Russians for what they are and what their historical experience has exposed them to. Last thing I say about their historical experience, they know full well, and Putin has said so, that most people who are running American foreign policy not only have never served in any war, but have never worn a uniform. Okay. That's about 9 out of 10. Okay. That means something. If you don't know what war is like, you don't take it as seriously as you should.
All right. And so we're back, and we want to now ask our panel to make various comments. I want to start with you, Helga, for what you've just seen Ray do. I want to welcome Bill and Harley back. I hope you're both alive this time. Okay, yeah, there you are. Or you're functioning, right? Okay, so Helga, if you might want to respond to what you just saw with Ray.
Well, I'm always delighted when I hear Ray recite poetry because he does it so well. And I think, it's an example. If you really want to study other countries and understand something about them, read their poetry, try to understand how they express their most inner feelings and thoughts. And I think that is actually a beautiful way of really getting at what is the alternative to the endless wars. And this period of the last 20 years in particular has been erring. We have lost the way. We have completely gone in the wrong direction. And I think the alternative to it is not only the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, but the dialogue of civilizations. And I can only say, every time you start to enter the culture of another country, it can be a big culture with a long tradition, 5,000 years or longer, or it can be a relatively new country or small country. But if they produce something which is, a poet, a culture, a literature, they have a soul. And, I think if you want to discuss it in terms of religious terms, the Creator allowed for so many nations and so many cultures to emerge because it is more beautiful. Because on the one side, they are specific. They have, developed own language, own tradition, own culture, own poetry, own music. But on the other side, you can find the universal principles which unites them all. And I find I have been extremely enriched in my life. And I can say that for my late husband as well, who was a complete world citizen and, in a sense, could immediately communicate with the patriots of all countries on an equal level because he was not arrogant. He didn't come as as somebody who would look down on them or talk down to them. But, people respected Lynn as an American patriot because they recognized that he was a world citizen. And once you start thinking that way and give up this stupid arrogance and America first, and this is really a wrong way of thinking. You have to love all of mankind and love other nations and get involved, find out something about them. And then it would be so easy to make the world peaceful. And that's why I really appreciate what Ray does, and the way he does it is indeed very creative and unique.
I just want to say something before we come back to Bill. I know because you have other things. You are also very conversant in the field of Russia and in intelligence in particular. But Harley, let me just ask you, because you've got a kind of unique vantage point, including from where you are now. You're sitting in Potsdam, I think. And you, as an American, have been there for a long time. You get a sense of different worlds, different perspective. And at the same time, you know Jack Stockwell very well. You, of course, you worked with Lyndon LaRouche all those decades. What's your sort of view of things, what you've heard today, and also just in terms of the conversation here?
Well, I want to come back to something that Helga brought up, which is this idea of revenge, this idea that somehow you deal with these kinds of problems by counter-striking. And, you know, Dennis, you asked me earlier today to take a look and see if I could find some serious reflections from Americans and Western people on what 9/11 really meant in terms of the changes in the world. and why that would, by being self-conscious of that, you could come up with a way to change the direction we're going. And I have to say, most of what I saw in the media was banal. It was ahistoric. Things like, where were you on 9/11? No depth or sense of history. And what you heard from Ray is an example, and also from Helga, and always from Lynn, that you have to look at these things historically. And I did find one article, and I just want to read a couple of quotes from it, because I think it does begin to get at the question that we have to look at. If we're going to take this opportunity by the end of the war in Afghanistan, and if it is in fact the end of an era of these regime change wars, what the potential is for change. But you have to break with this mentality. This is an article by someone named Branko Marcetić, and he said that what happened on 9/11 was the channeling of the rage and sadness of Americans into a geopolitical revenge fantasy that overlapped the policy intentions of the unilateralists in the US government. And he went on to say that with these never-ending wars that were conducted in countries whose governments were entirely uninvolved in an attack that was in fact carried out and facilitated by the Saudis, he said, in this process, the US sent just over 7,000 of its own soldiers to their deaths, which means that Al-Qaeda could never measure up to the American politicians themselves in the business of taking American lives. And when you see people like Lindsey Graham or Nikki Haley or others saying today that we have to go back into Afghanistan, we have to teach them a lesson, it's a disgrace for us to have pulled out, you see that this lesson has not been learned by the people who were responsible for this devastating defeat of the idea of the American superpower. So I would just suggest that we do have to look to history, to poetry, to great drama, to enable us to fully think through how this change can take place, and we can break with the cycle of revenge and geopolitics.
Well, Bill, of course, your whole approach, or the approach of your team, the Thin Thread team, did not even get to this point, and that there was no need to have wars because, in fact, you had the ability to do something which would avoid even getting to that point. I'd like you to say something about that, because there would be people certainly watching that would not know about what you and your team had worked on and had accomplished.
Well, fundamentally, we developed a system that was able to filter out relevant information from all kinds of massive flows of data anywhere in the world, and just filter it out what was relevant to the groups of organizations that were intending international crime or some threat to internationally, either militarily or politically or whatever. We could of course pick that out, and it was all done automatically. Problem was we made it so cheap. And here's one of the fundamental drivers behind all of this. This is what President Eisenhower, when he was leaving office, warned us about: the military-industrial complex influence and gaining of power in terms of the country and how the society works. That's really what's really taking over here, because that's when the Soviet Union fell apart in 89, 90 timeframe. Why they were all looking around to saying, well, where's our next enemy to be able to justify the existence of the bulk of spending that we do now? So in other words, they were looking around at ways and means of finding enemies to justify their existence. Part of that is having wars, because wars are very profitable, and it justifies having a very, very large scale spending on military, and justifies the industry behind it, and the intelligence, and all of that supports it. And that's the problem. This military, industrial, governmental, media, banking, technology cabal is just feeding off all of this conflict and creating conflict. Whereas when they first started about wanting to invite Ukraine into NATO, I was arguing, well, if we're going to do that with Ukraine, why don't we also invite Russia? Let's include them, make them inclusive, not be exclusive. Don't treat them like enemies, which is what they were doing, because they needed to have a justification for all their spending and needed to have a threat. So that they created this threat of big bad Russians. Now, it is true they've got enough weapons, nuclear weapons, to help annihilate the entire planet. So you do have to treat them with some respect, and that's not what's been happening. Instead, we isolate them, make them feel like they're an enemy. We treat them like an enemy, and that is not the right way to go. President Trump talking to Putin and trying to gain relations back with them was the right way to go. And instead, we're still captured by this military, industrial, governmental, intelligence, complex that's running our secret government, having secret laws, doing their own thing, no matter what is said. And they're so arrogant now; they do it out in the open. They get caught, and they say, "So what? What are you going to do about it?" And you can see that the Supreme Court backed away from it. They backed away from the challenge that we put forward on unconstitutionality of the bulk acquisition of U.S. citizens' data. They backed away from that. They just didn't even want to hear it. So, and I felt was their job. They're supposed to defend the Constitution. That's what everybody in that court does. They all have that oath, as does everyone else in government. So, I just see that this is the really the major metastasizing problem in our country that's causing all this corruption and this criminality around the world, and we need to stop it. So that's what I see as the major problem.
Well, that actually helps to bring up something, and maybe Helga may have a response to you, but I also wanted to pose this to her, because she alluded earlier to this idea of this World Health program, of the fact that there is a common enemy that mankind could address. And at the same time, what gets interesting is to look at the way in which this whole biological weapons question has come up often now. The Russians have just brought it up in terms of biological weapons labs in some of the countries. Ukraine and Georgia, I think, are the two that they just named. I think Lavrov was referencing that. There's, of course, the fact of the anthrax attack, which is almost always left out when you come to 9/11 anniversaries. That was on September 18th through 25th in the case of the United States. And so there are biological weapons that have been used in various ways. And then, of course, the whole blame game that's been attempted with that. Whereas, in fact, a public health platform, if you were doing just working together with the various countries in the world to deal with what is a consistently evolving circumstance. In fact, I just want to reference something which I had forgotten, wasn't an occasion, I mentioned it to Helga before. We spoke to a researcher in New York yesterday. It's well known, and for about 35 years, he's been making this contention that the Bronx of New York in particular, in New York City more generally, is like an epicenter for the generation of disease. And he talks about this as being, his name is Roderick Wallace, and he talked about this as being well known, it's been going on for decades, and that whatever else may have happened with respect to the recent pandemic, the problem is that without addressing the public health question, he believes that what you're going to get is something like a bubonic plague. He used the term bubonic plague 2.0. We don't like using those kind of terms, but what his point was is that the failure to deal seriously with world health and the conditions that create the ability to spread pandemics means that you're inevitably going to get some kind of crisis way beyond what we've even seen so far. And so it occurred to me, and in part I'm responding because there's a couple of different kinds of questions we got, but I want to keep it on topic. I wanted to have you, Helga, say a little bit more about what you're thinking about this as a world issue. You were at Afghanistan, but your whole idea was that this is a world collaboration and how it might address some of these other matters that have come into focus in recent months.
Well, we have seen this very clearly that, if you don't pay attention to the needs of every single country, we had the pandemic raging in Brazil, in Peru. We have own members who almost died in Peru because there was no oxygen to be gotten. I have some friends in India who have, reported how many people were burned because the facilities were overburdened, and the whole place was like a nightmare to live in. We know that many situations in Africa are completely overextended. Hospitals are not existing, or health intensive care is not existing. And it just shows that we are one human race. And my husband has already made this biological task force in 1973, because he was very concerned that the lowering of the living standard in several continents, in Africa, Latin America, large parts of Asia, would eventually collapse the immune system and make people more susceptible to the emergence of new and old diseases, which eventually would, lead to a biological holocaust. And I think what we have seen so far is just, that if you don't pay attention to it in every country, it comes back to you. I think the hoarding of vaccines and, the developing countries only having 1 to 2% of their population being vaccinated means, new variants can develop there. And therefore, it just shows it does not work. I mean, if you have, like, in 3,000 years ago, when people traveled by camel and donkey, maybe pandemics wouldn't travel in the same way. But now, either you cut down all international travel, and that has practically happened already, the so-called lockdowns and the losses to the economy and so on. This gives you a pre-taste that if you want to have a modern economy, you have to take health, public health, as a human right, and that either we can unite around that, or we will go into a dark age. I mean, we are already on the verge of a dark age, and I think people are not conscious about it, but we are.
I'm going to combine a couple of different questions we got. These are directed generally to you, Bill, and I'm going to get to what the core idea was behind them. And then after that, I'm going to just sort of get final thoughts from everyone. And it's with this. Is there a way, given how far down the road on surveillance that the United States and other countries have gone, is there a way to actually reverse this? And is there a way to keep people safe, but at the same time close down the illegal and criminal usage of technologies to control populations?
The short answer is yes. And there is a technology way to do that. And we had been developing that in the 1990s inside NSA. The problem was people recognized that, okay? And what they recognized was that we could, in fact, find anything that anybody was doing that was illegal, anywhere in the world, and inside any government. So that was really the threat, because we could uncover what our government was doing within its closed doors, so to speak. What the intelligence committees were agreeing with, what their people were talking about, what they were doing, what they actually did, as opposed to what they said they wanted to do. And we could monitor all that. It was a monitoring program for. We would use things like the network logs all around the U.S. government of every agency, or any network log we could get to anywhere in the world, and just analyze who was on the network log and what they were doing, and building relationships around the world as to who was involved with whom and so on. So all of this material, all this understanding of criminality and connections of organized networks that were involved in all this criminality and illegal government operation would be exposed to us and be available for us to look at and point and document for a court. And that's what they didn't want. So that was one of the main things they got rid of in our program. And it was to hide what they were doing from the public in the United States and around the world. And that's true of every government. Every government seems to be doing the same things. I think the German government's found the same thing with the BND. The British, I even addressed some of that with the House of Lords when I testified there about the lies they were being told, that the GCHQ couldn't filter out their information because there was just too much data, and that was simply false. I mean, it was commercially available to do that from 12 years earlier. I talked to them. It was commercially available, so it's not unique to anybody that we would perceive as being former communist countries or dictatorships or anything throughout history. Nothing's unique there. It's also common with all the democracies or countries we call democracies. We're really, really exceedingly close to a police state right now.
Okay. Yeah. So in other words, the truth is that the problem in fact, is not finding terrorists. The problem is that you can find all of the actual people committing crime, and many of them are in government and related institutions.
That's right.
We're not able to get to that. Okay. All right. That's good to know. So Harley, we're pretty much at the end here. I want to just ask, and there's one question. I'm going to give that to Helga at the end. It will be better done, I think, that way. If there's anything that you have in terms of any final thoughts.
Well, I think what's useful about having this commemoration of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is that it comes in a moment of a confluence of crises. The end of the Afghan war, unfortunately, the continuation of endless wars, the pandemic, global drug epidemic, and a financial crisis. And what it really means, if you go back to Lyndon LaRouche's discussion with Stockwell, is that his forecasts begin by looking at the breakdown of the system. And what we're seeing now is a systemic collapse. Now, we can sit here and point fingers at everyone responsible and complain and moan and whine all we want. But what we should realize is this does give us an opportunity to change this, because people now realize that the situation is not going to get better unless they take responsibility, individual citizens. And that's how our system actually works. So I think this gives us an opportunity to do the kinds of things that Helga is talking about, pull together the major powers in the world to work for mutually beneficial economic development policies. And so I think that's what people should take from this, is that out of the catastrophes of the last, and I would say the last 50 years, the possibility that the best of mankind can enable us to pull ourselves not only out of this, but into a whole new era of development.
Thanks. And Bill, as you answer your question, I'd like you to particularly address one thing in the course of whatever else you're going to say, which is how you think the American people could take this moment and take this reflection that is going on today. You see it in the various ceremonies and so on, and move to do what you've just indicated could be done. It's not a technical problem.
Well, I've always been saying things like democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to participate. And what it means is people have to get involved much more than they have been up to this time, and be there to witness things like you saw the ballot stuffing in Georgia after hours when they pulled the ballots out from under out from under a table in a suitcase and so on. That's because people left. There were no witnesses there to stick around. And I'm just saying, if anybody's there and you have witnesses there, they stay there until everybody's gone, not until some people. You just don't leave because of that, because you can't trust people. And that was clear. The corruption that was so widespread in that election was so obvious across state lines and across, just seeing what was happening and watching our criminal government turn a blind eye to it. Go, oh, nothing happened, really. Oh, sure. Yeah, we didn't see that suitcase come out from under the table. And how many ballots arrive at a polling station in a suitcase? Huh? Don't they come in a box? I thought that was the procedure. I'm just a simple country boy, but that seemed to me to be the right way to do it. But so the idea is you have to be in there and stay there, and don't let people throw you out, get you out of the way, so that they can do this kind of corrupt activity. And stop it. And the way to do that is let's start with 2022. get that election and be there and participate in that, and then also and follow up on every election. You can't stop. You've got to be involved all the time. Otherwise, you don't use your democracy to participate and be a part of it, you're going to lose it.
Okay. And Helga, the question that had come in just as we were in this talk referenced the concert of last night, and just said something about the power of classical culture was never more apparent than it is in these moments. And since the future of humanity in one sense hangs in the balance, could you expand on the potential to use these ideas like classical music, culture, and so on to free our minds and embrace the better angels of the nature of humanity?
Well, I think that we are in a period where many people sense that, well, let me put it this way. This is now my absolute starkest conviction, that, there's all this talk about the competition with China, the, big systemic rivalry. Well, I mean, the Chinese are doing a lot of things which the West is not doing. For example, they just, and even Tucker Carlson brought it up, and that's why I think it's worth mentioning it as one element. Xi Jinping just forbid that children and young people watch more than or play more than 3 hours per week on internet gaming. And the argument for it is that, it's a virtual reality and this is a waste of time, because in that time people are not studying, they are not pay attention to their education. And since China wants to have a future of scientists, of engineers, of teachers, artists, that it's a waste of time if people spend all their time in internet gaming. Now, I full-heartedly agree with that, because, it's just one of the things which have gone completely wrong. People become addicted to this kind of internet games, and it is terrible for their cognitive ability. It's terrible for their social behavior. We have seen in the past that there were many times connections between violence and school shootings and even terrorism and violent video games. So I think that's a good thing to do that. I'm glad that Tucker Carlson made that point, because, it's important that when people start to realize that what they have demonized may not be so terrible at all, it's a first baby step. Then, the Chinese are correcting many other things. They are curbing real estate speculation. They're doing all kinds of things to correct permanently. Even if they make mistakes, they somehow then, make it better. I have not seen in the West anything like that. The West has been in such an utter disaster. We have so many collapses in infrastructure, in inability for flood control. Germany just had this century flood, which was not climate change. It was just no investment in infrastructure, in, flood control measures. And that's why almost 200 people drowned in Germany. I mean, this is not Bangladesh. This is supposed to be the fourth largest economic power on the planet. Are they correcting it? Well, not really. The people who are living in this area are extremely bitter that there is no coordination from the government at all. I could make an endless list where things have gone haywire in the West, but people don't want to correct it. The politicians don't dare to address it because of elections. And in general, I'm not, if we don't get enough people to do what Ray McGovern did tonight by reciting poetry from Russia or any other country, if we are not willing to, overcome this terrible mediocrity in which the West has fallen, for the price or for the sake of individual liberties. It's not freedom. There is a big difference between liberty and freedom. Freedom is what Schiller talked about, to do with passion what is necessary, to find your freedom in necessity. That is freedom. Or what Beethoven said, so streng wie frei. You follow the rules and you, in a creative way, enlarge the rules in a lawful way. That is freedom. What is not freedom is everything goes. And the West has gone in the direction that this exaggerated individuality, where everything is allowed. You have now 50 sexes. Oh no, tomorrow we have 75 sexes. And if you don't obey the rules, to follow that sort of strange geometry, you will have 120 sexes the next day, and so forth and so on. In music, they're composing now noise, and they call this music. They even have the audacity to rewrite classical compositions, like from Beethoven, which is, in my view, a sacrilege, which people should go to the dungeon, not just to the jail. They should sit in the dungeon for many years for such a crime. There's so many things which are the result of the so-called liberal value system, that nobody has anymore the authority to say, this is the truth. This is a Socratic dialogue, how we can arrive at the truth. No, if you say that, then you are already an authoritarian, because you insist that there is a knowable truth. And the next thing is you are a Nazi and a fascist for sure. I mean, this has gone haywire. And I think we have to really, if we want to get out of this crisis in the West, there is only one way. We have to go back to the best thinkers of our tradition, like Plato, Socrates, Augustinus, Nicolaus of Cues, Kepler, Leibniz, Lessing, Schiller, the great founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Einstein, and then you add those figures of universal history from other cultures, and you start to consult with them, and you throw away almost all the secondary literature, all the footnotes of all these academics or academics, and you go back to the sources. That's what humanists always did when they wanted to get out of a crisis. And that method, going back to the sources, is true for philosophy, for science, for music, for poetry. And, in that sense, music is simply the most easy accessible, because, it is an international language. And, if a classical composition does touch the heart and the mind and the creative power of the audience, it doesn't matter which language you speak, because the human mind is a universal existence. So I think the only way how I can imagine that we find back the right way is we have to go to the highest traditions of our cultures, the Italian Renaissance, the German classical period, the American Revolution, and also other high points which fit that characterization. And we have to start reading again. We have to start thinking again. Serious questions about ontologically relevant questions like natural law, like what is the faculty of the mind where true innovation, which increases the power in the universe, come from? What is that creative process? What are the life sciences? There are so many areas where we get to the fundamentals, and a lot of things can be cut out and need to be cut out. But in that sense, we are in a competition of the systems, because the Chinese are doing a lot of that, the Russians are doing a lot of that, and they're wasting much less energy on totally superfluous things than we do. So it's up to us.
Harley Schlanger, Bill Binney, Helga LaRouche, thank you very much for what we've done today. And we want to thank everybody that actually was able to hang in there and stay with us through the various burps we'll call them that, electronic burps that shouldn't have been in this system. And so we want to thank you and want to just leave you with this thought. On September 14th, we will be observing the 700th anniversary of the death of the poet Dante Alighieri. Dante wrote a poem called the Commedia, 3 parts to that poem. And he begins the poem at the place that Ray McGovern is trying to get the American population to arrive, what Ray calls metanoia. And Dante begins talking by, he says, in the middle of the journey of my life, I found myself in a dark wood, and that he had lost his way. He had been very active in politics in Florence, the city of Florence, but he was ousted there in the year 1302, and he never returned. Was never able to come back home over 19 years. And he wrote this poem, and the poem was not a case of revenge. Yes, it does have a lot of his political enemies in it, and yes, they do end up in various circles of hell. I should say that the poem deals with hell, purgatory, and paradise, and it's Dante's journey through all of those. Dante is accompanied by the poet Virgil. This idea that Helga's just talked to you about the notion of great culture and great ideas of culture, being able to see the world from that standpoint, is very important in this poem. And so first he descends into hell, and then he ascends through that to purgatory and then to paradise. And the importance of this is that these are different states of the mind. But what's important about Dante, the real Dante, and what he did, is that he created a language by synthesizing many of the different dialects of what was Italian. And the notion was to give the people a language of their own, not the administrative language of Latin, but a language that was born from their own, not only experience, but their own passion. But then to elevate their passions by developing this idea, and he used himself as the center of it, in which he is caused to change his way of thinking. And the poem is about that. And the poem is a recounting of that. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful thing. Of course, I and other people that don't speak Italian never really hear the poem except the music of the poem. But what's relevant, and this is what I think Helga was saying before, that's exactly why you want to try to incorporate or encounter and try to incorporate the idea of different languages and different people. Why is that important for 9/11? Why is it important today? As was said, for 20 years, the United States has been involved for 100 years in a pursuit which has been deadly and lethal, but it hasn't actually brought the persons that were involved to justice. So justice, therefore, does not lead through that pathway. That's obviously what that means. So through what pathway does justice lie? And this is the issue that I believe people should consider. You might want to go to either internet, or if you're lucky enough to actually still have books, as some of us do, go open up your copy of Dante's Commedia and think about that great poet and what he left. And despite the fact that he was exiled from home, like Ed Snowden is exiled from the United States, it didn't prevent him from changing the world and changing his people to create the Italian language, and the Italian Renaissance also owes him a great debt. And so this is what we have to think about, that if we were to make the lives of the people that died both at the time of 9/11 and then subsequently because of those events, we want to make that meaningful. The image of a restored, developed, and vibrant Afghanistan and other surrounding nations as a product of a restored and vibrant United States and other nations who become better because they see this new pathway, that is the legacy we should try to make sure that history can record that we left this time. So on behalf of the Schiller Institute, I want to thank you all, and we'll see you again.